I remember the eggs. That's what haunts me most when I think about the beginning. Not the screaming, not the sirens, not the wet sound of teeth meeting flesh somewhere down our street. I remember standing in my grandparents' kitchen on a Tuesday morning, watching my grandfather crack eggs into a cast-iron skillet that had belonged to his mother, and thinking about how bored I was. 26 years old, between jobs, crashing in the upstairs bedroom of a farmhouse 40 minutes outside of Covington, Kentucky. And my biggest concern was whether I'd have enough cell signal to stream something after breakfast. Grandpa Earl didn't speak much in the mornings. He was 78, built like a shortened oak tree, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same wood. He moved through his kitchen with military precision. Spatula here, salt there, plate already warming on the counter. Grandma Dottie sat at the table behind me, reading the Kenton County Register on her tablet, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She was 75, sharper than anyone gave her credit for. With silver hair she still pinned up every morning, like she was expecting company. "You sleep all right?" Earl asked, without turning around. "Fine," I said. I hadn't. I'd been up until 3 watching job listing pages refresh and feeling the particular shame of a grown man living in his childhood vacation spot. "Smells good." "It's eggs, Marcus. It always smells good." Dottie looked up from her tablet. "There's something strange happening in Erlanger. They've closed the interchange." I didn't think much of it. Construction, maybe an accident. Erlanger was 20 minutes east, close enough to notice, far enough to ignore. Earl set my plate down. 2 eggs, toast cut diagonal, 3 strips of bacon with the fat still curling. He sat across from me and ate without ceremony. The television in the living room was on. It was always on, tuned to a local station that ran morning news between segments about gardening and high school sports. I heard the anchor's voice shift. That subtle tightening that happens when someone reads copy they weren't prepared for. I didn't get up. I wish I had. "Multiple reports," the anchor said. "Residents are being advised to stay indoors." Dottie set her tablet down. Earl kept chewing. I looked between them, trying to read the room the way I always did in that house, checking whether something required my attention or whether it was just background noise in a life that had too much of it. "Earl," Dottie said. He looked at her. Something passed between them, a communication I wasn't part of, built across 53 years of marriage and whatever else they shared that I'd never been told about. He set his fork down carefully, wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin, and stood. "Finish your breakfast," he said to me. "What's going on?" "Finish your breakfast, Marcus." He walked to the living room. I heard the volume go up. The anchor was speaking faster now. And there was a second voice, someone calling in, their words stumbling over each other. I heard attack and biting and not responding to commands. I pushed my chair back. The screen showed aerial footage of the interchange Dottie had mentioned. Cars were stopped in both directions. Between them, figures moved wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. They moved wrong. Too fast in some directions, too jerky, shoulders leading instead of heads. One of them caught a man trying to climb over a median barrier. The camera didn't look away fast enough. "Jesus," I said. Earl was already walking toward the hallway. Dottie was behind me. I hadn't heard her get up. She put her hand on my shoulder, and her grip was stronger than I expected. "Come away from the television," she said. "Grandma, what is that? What's happening to those people?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the hallway where Earl had disappeared, then back at me. Her expression wasn't fear. It was something closer to resignation. The face of someone who'd been waiting for bad news and had just received confirmation. "Come with me," she said. "Both of us need to go downstairs." I didn't know we had a downstairs. The house had been in our family since 1961. My grandfather bought it when he left the army, back when the land around it was nothing but tobacco fields and gravel roads. I'd spent summers there as a kid, explored every inch of it. The attic with its boxes of old uniforms, the root cellar behind the kitchen, the barn that leaned slightly east and smelled like diesel and old hay. I thought I knew every room, every closet, every creaking board. I was wrong. Earl was standing in the hallway outside the master bedroom, pressing his palm flat against the wall beside a framed photograph of their wedding. The photo swung aside on a hinge I'd never noticed, revealing a metal panel with a keypad. He punched in a code, 8 digits, entered without hesitation, and something clicked deep inside the wall. A section of floor beside him shifted, not dramatically, not like a movie. It simply sank an inch and slid sideways, revealing a staircase descending into fluorescent light. "Go," Earl said. "What is this?" "Marcus, go down the stairs." Dottie moved past me. She descended without hesitation, her hand trailing the metal railing that was bolted to a concrete wall. I followed because I didn't know what else to do. Earl came last, and I heard the floor panel slide back into place above us with a hydraulic whisper. The stairs went down 12 feet. At the bottom was a door, steel, thick as my fist, with a wheel lock like something from a submarine. Dottie spun it with practiced ease. The door swung inward, and the space beyond took my breath away. It was a bunker, a real one. Not a survivalist's fantasy cobbled together from YouTube tutorials. A professional installation with poured concrete walls, ventilation ducts humming softly overhead, LED panels casting even white light across a space that stretched further than our living room. Shelving units lined the walls, packed with labeled containers. I saw water purification equipment, medical supplies with organized tags, a communication station with radios and monitors, and racks, weapon racks, holding rifles I'd never known my grandfather owned. "Sit down," Dottie said, pulling a chair away from a small table. "How long has this been here?" Earl sealed the door behind us, the wheel lock engaged with a heavy clunk. "Since 1983. 1980. I ran my hand over my face. "You built a bunker in 1983 and never told anyone?" "Your mother knew," Dottie said. "She chose not to believe it was necessary." "Necessary for what?" Earl moved past me toward the communication station. He flipped switches and monitors flickered to life. Security cameras showing our property from multiple angles. The driveway, the barn, the road, the kitchen we'd been eating breakfast in 6 minutes ago. "Necessary for this," he said. On one of the monitors, something moved at the edge of our property line. It came from the tree line to the north. A figure in a torn jacket, walking with that wrong gait I'd seen on television. It reached our fence and pressed against it, not climbing, just pushing, like it didn't understand the concept of an obstacle. Then a second appeared. Then a third. "Earl," Dottie said quietly. She was watching too. "I see them. Those are the Mitchells' property line. They came through the Mitchells' land." Earl said nothing. He reached above the monitor station and pulled down a binder, thick, tabbed, organized. He opened it to a page near the front and ran his finger down a checklist. Water supply, full. Filtration, operational. Food stores, 18 months for 3. Generator, fueled. Fuel reserve, 400 gallons. Medical, stocked as of March. Communications. He toggled a switch. Static filled the room, then a voice. frantic and distant, calling for help on a frequency I didn't recognize. "Who is that?" I asked. "Doesn't matter right now," Earl said. He closed the binder and turned to face me. His expression was calm, not happy, not frightened. "Ready?" "Marcus, I'm going to explain some things. I need you to listen and not interrupt. Can you do that?" I nodded. "Good. Because what's happening up there isn't going to stop, and the three of us need to be aligned about what comes next." Dottie took my hand. Her fingers were warm, steady. Earl began to talk. He told me he'd worked for a division of the Army that didn't have a name civilians would recognize. Not special forces, something adjacent, something quieter. His official record said he'd served as a logistics coordinator at Fort Campbell from 1966 to 1982. What he actually did, he said, was manage containment protocols for biological research that went wrong more often than anyone wanted to admit. "I wasn't a scientist," he said, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "I was the man they called when a scientist made a mess. I organized evacuations. I sealed facilities. I burned things that needed burning." "Biological research," I repeated. "You mean weapons?" "I mean research that could become weaponized. There's a distinction, and it matters less than you think." Dottie sat beside me at the table, her hands folded in her lap. She'd known all of this. Her calm wasn't performance. It was the settled composure of a woman who'd had 40 years to process what her husband had seen. "In 1979, Earl continued, there was an incident at a facility in West Virginia. Underground lab, joint program between Army and NIH. They were studying neurological reactivation, trying to find ways to restore brain function after trauma, battlefield applications, bring back soldiers who'd been clinically dead for minutes." He paused. "They succeeded in a way. The subjects regained motor function, autonomous movement. But the higher functions, personality, memory, restraint, those didn't come back. What came back was hunger." I felt sick. "You're telling me this was manufactured?" "I'm telling you it was possible. In '79, we contained it. 3 subjects, sealed underground, incinerated. The research was supposedly destroyed. I left the program in '82 because I stopped believing it was actually destroyed." "And the bunker?" "I built this because I spent 16 years watching men in uniforms make promises about containment while cutting corners on every protocol I designed. I built this because I knew, Dottie and I both knew, that eventually someone would either recreate the research or lose control of whatever samples survived." On the monitors behind him, more figures had gathered at our fence line. 7 now, pressing against the wire in that mindless, persistent way. One of them had found a gap where a post had rotted, and it was pushing through, tearing its shirt on barbed wire without flinching. "Are they what I think they are?" I asked. "Are they dead?" "I don't know their exact status," Earl said. "Neurologically compromised. Motor function without cognition. Whether their hearts are beating or not, I genuinely don't know. The ones I saw in '79 still had pulses. They were alive, technically, just not human anymore in any way that mattered." Dottie stood and moved to a shelf. She pulled down a container labeled Medical Reference and withdrew a laminated sheet. It was a protocol document, faded but legible, with headers I recognized as military formatting. "Your grandfather wrote this," she said. "Response procedures. What to do in the first 24 hours, the first week, the first month. We've updated it over the years." "Updated it? How often did you think about this?" "Every year," Earl said simply. "Every year I checked the supplies, reviewed the protocols. and hoped I was a paranoid old man wasting his retirement on something that would never happen. He didn't look paranoid now. He looked validated, and I could see that validation brought him no joy whatsoever. The radio crackled again. A different voice this time, calmer, more structured. "This is Kenton County Emergency Management. All residents within the Covington metropolitan area are advised to shelter in place. Do not approach individuals exhibiting erratic behavior. Do not attempt to render aid. Emergency services are currently overwhelmed. Repeat, shelter in place." "Overwhelmed," I said. "Already overwhelmed. It's been, what, an hour?" "Less," Earl said. He turned to the monitors. The figure that had pushed through the fence gap was now in our yard, moving toward the house with that lurching gait. It reached the back porch and walked directly into the door. Didn't try the handle. Just walked into it, then pressed against it. Then began hitting it with open palms, rhythmic, stupid, relentless. Earl watched it for a moment. "We're safe down here," he said. "That door upstairs is reinforced behind the drywall. But we should talk about what happens when we need to go back up." The first day underground was the longest of my life. Not because of danger. We were sealed tight, insulated from whatever was happening above, but because of the knowing. The monitors showed us everything, our property, our road. The slow, terrible accumulation of figures moving through a world that no longer belonged to the living in any meaningful sense. By noon, there were 30 or more visible on our cameras. They wandered without purpose, gravitating toward sound. A car alarm triggered somewhere to the south drew a cluster of them in that direction, leaving our yard temporarily clear. Earl watched with the focused attention of a man taking notes for later. "They respond to sound," he said. "Not sight, not at distance. Sound, primarily. You're studying them." I'm confirming what I already suspected. The subjects in 79 were the same. Audio reactive. Visual processing was degraded. They could detect movement at close range, but ignored stationary objects. So if you stay still and quiet, you become invisible, relatively. He wrote something in a small notebook. But don't mistake that for safety. They don't tire. They don't sleep. If one detects you and vocalizes, others respond to the vocalization. It cascades. Dottie brought me water and a sandwich from the stores. The food was unremarkable. Canned bread, vacuum-sealed meat, filtered water. But she prepared it like it was a normal lunch. I watched her slice the sandwich diagonal, the way she always cut mine when I was a child visiting in summers. "You're taking this very calmly," I told her. "I've had 40 years to be afraid, sweetheart. I used them up. Weren't you angry? When he told you what he'd seen, what he'd done, weren't you angry he brought that knowledge into your home?" She considered this, setting the knife down precisely on the cutting board she'd installed in this bunker specifically for moments like this. I was angry for about 3 years. Then I realized anger was a luxury I couldn't afford. He gave me the truth, and the truth gave us time to prepare. Most people up there, she gestured toward the ceiling, they're getting the truth right now, with no time at all. She was right. The radio told us what no time looked like. Fragmentary broadcasts, increasingly desperate. The Erlanger interchange had become a massacre site. Cincinnati was reporting cases. Covington's hospital had fallen silent after a final transmission requesting military assistance that never came. Someone on a ham radio frequency was crying, asking if anyone could hear them, repeating their address over and over like a prayer. Earl monitored without responding. I asked him why. Because responding tells them we're here, and because we can't help them. His voice was flat, not cold, exhausted already by decisions he'd made in advance. Every response is a promise. I won't make promises I can't keep. By evening, though evening meant nothing underground, the power grid failed. We knew because our cameras flickered as the bunker's generator kicked in seamlessly. The transition was smooth. Earl had tested it monthly for decades. But on the monitors, the world above went dark. Streetlights on the distant road died. The glow of Covington on the horizon vanished. Only our property remained visible through infrared cameras that painted everything in ghostly green. In infrared, the infected were brighter than the background. Their bodies ran hot, metabolisms burning without regulation, consuming themselves. Earl pointed this out clinically. They're unsustainable, he said. Biologically, they're burning through calories faster than they can replenish. Without food intake, they should deteriorate within weeks, maybe less. So we wait. We wait, but... He held up a finger. We also prepare for the possibility that I'm wrong. That they find sustenance, that they adapt. Hope for the best outcome. Plan for the worst. I lay on a cot that night in a room my grandparents had prepared decades before I was born. The ceiling was concrete, close enough to touch. I could hear the ventilation system breathing for me, pulling filtered air from above. Somewhere beyond all this concrete and steel, the world I'd known was unraveling. I thought about my mother in Columbus, my friends in Louisville. I thought about whether they had bunkers. They didn't. 3 days passed before we heard anything from outside that wasn't a broadcast. On the morning of the 4th day, or what our clock said was morning, the perimeter camera on the south side picked up movement that was different. Deliberate, coordinated, human. 2 figures approached along the drainage ditch that ran parallel to our property. They moved in short bursts, stopping to scan, communicating with hand signals. One carried a hunting rifle. The other had a backpack that looked ready to burst. They were heading toward our barn. "Earl," I said. He was already watching. "I see them. They're alive. They're people. They are." He didn't move toward the door. "Shouldn't we? Watch." They reached the barn and slipped inside through the side entrance. On the barn camera, which I hadn't even known existed, I watched them clear the space, checking corners. Professionals or something close to it. The one with the rifle was a woman, mid-30s, with dark hair tied back tight. The other was a man roughly my age, lighter build, moving like someone who'd been taught recently rather than trained long ago. "They're going to shelter in the barn," I said. "We should help them." Earl watched for a full minute before speaking. "Describe to me what helping them looks like." "We bring them down here. We have supplies for 18 months for 3, 9 months for 4, less than 7 for 5. Every person we add is a mathematical reduction in our survival window. They'll die out there. Maybe. Or maybe they'll move on by morning." He turned his chair to face me. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. I didn't spend 40 years building this for the world. I built it for you and your grandmother. Every decision I make will be filtered through that priority. If that makes me a villain, I'll wear it." Dottie appeared in the doorway behind us. She'd been listening. "Earl," she said. "The woman has blood on her leg, below the knee." We all looked at the monitor. She was right. The woman in the barn had sat down against a hay bale, and in the infrared image, her left calf was dark with something wet. The man was crouching beside her, wrapping it with cloth from his pack. "Could be a bite," Earl said. Could be a cut from barbed wire, I countered. Could be anything. Could be. And if it's a bite and we bring her underground, we've sealed ourselves in with a ticking clock. I stared at him. This was my grandfather. The man who'd taught me to fish, who'd let me drive his truck across the back field when I was 14, who'd mailed me $20 every birthday until I was 20 with a note that just said, "Spend it, stupid." He was calculating whether to let a wounded woman die 50 yards above our heads. There has to be a middle ground, I said. Dottie moved into the room and sat beside Earl. She put her hand on his arm, not pleading, not commanding, just present. "We could use the intercom at the barn entrance," she said. "Speak to them without opening the bunker. Assess the situation." Earl looked at her. Another of those silent conversations passed between them. Then he nodded. "We observe until morning. If they're still alive, still coherent, still human in the ways that matter, we make contact. But we do not open that door until I'm satisfied." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say that waiting could mean her bleeding out, that every hour was a risk. But I also understood something I hadn't before. Earl wasn't being cruel. He was being responsible for the only thing he could control, our survival. And he'd earned that right through 4 decades of preparation while the rest of us slept. "Okay," I said. "Morning." I didn't sleep that night either. I watched the barn camera like it was a vigil, watching 2 strangers huddled together in my grandfather's barn. Alive for now, maybe injured, definitely frightened. And I made a decision that I didn't tell Earl about. At 4 in the morning, I moved. The bunker was designed with Earl's precision. Every surface predictable, every sound mappable. I knew which panels of flooring had give, which sections of corridor carried echoes. I moved through the dark like I was robbing my own family, which in a sense I was. Robbing them of the security they'd built by making a choice they hadn't sanctioned. The intercom system was mounted near the main entrance, a panel with switches labeled by location. Barn was 3rd from the left. I could speak to them without unsealing anything. The speaker on the barn end was disguised as a junction box on the interior wall. But speaking meant revealing that we were here. It meant crossing a line Earl had drawn. I pressed the switch. "Hello?" My voice felt too loud in the silent corridor. On the barn camera monitor above me, I saw both figures jolt awake. The man grabbed for something. The woman tried to stand and faltered. "Don't be scared. I'm in the property. I can see you on camera. Are you hurt?" Silence. Then the man spoke, turning in circles, trying to find the source. "Who is that? Where are you?" "My name is Marcus. This is my grandparents' property. The woman with you, is she bit?" More silence. I saw them exchange glances. Then the woman spoke, her voice tight with pain. "It's not a bite. I cut it on a fence getting away. It's deep, but it's not a bite. I swear it's not." "What's your name?" "Renee. This is Caleb. We came from Walton. Everything in Walton is..." She stopped, took a breath. "There's nothing left in Walton." Walton was 20 miles south. If the infection had spread that far already, the radius was growing faster than anything Earl's protocols had predicted. "Listen," I said. "I'm going to help you. But I need you to understand that I'm not the only person making decisions here. Sit tight. Don't make noise. There are things outside that respond to sound. You probably already know that. I'll come back to you at sunrise." "Thank you," Caleb said. "Thank you, man. It's been 3 days, and nobody. Thank you." I switched off the intercom and stood in the dark corridor, feeling the weight of what I'd done. I'd revealed our position, given our names, or mine at least. Made a promise that Earl specifically said he wouldn't make. When I turned around, Dottie was standing 10 feet behind me in her robe. I froze. "Your grandfather is still sleeping," she said quietly. "He takes a pill, has for years, doesn't usually wake before 6. Grandma, I heard everything." She stepped closer. In the low emergency lighting, her face was half shadow. "The woman's injury, you believe her?" "I don't know, but I couldn't just—" "I know." She touched my arm. "Your grandfather sees the world as systems, inputs and outputs, threats and assets. He's kept us alive this long because of it. But systems don't account for what we lose by following them perfectly." "So you're not angry?" "I'm terrified," she said plainly. "But I was terrified before you pressed that button. At least now we're terrified and doing something about it." We stood together in the corridor, grandmother and grandson, co-conspirators in an act of mercy that might get us killed. She told me we'd tell Earl together at breakfast. Frame it as done, as irreversible, as a situation to manage rather than a debate to have. She knew him better than anyone alive. "He'll be angry," she said. "Let him. Anger moves through him fast. It's the silence after that you need to worry about." I nodded. "Now go sleep," she said. 2 hours. You'll need it for whatever comes next." I didn't think I could sleep. But I lay down and was gone within minutes, my body overriding my mind, stealing rest while rest was available. A survival instinct I didn't know I had. When I woke, I smelled coffee. Earl was already at the monitors. He'd seen the barn footage. Earl didn't yell. That was worse. He sat at the communication station with his coffee, watching the barn camera where Renee and Caleb were awake, speaking to each other in whispers we couldn't hear. His face was perfectly still. The face I remembered from childhood when I'd broken something expensive, and he was deciding what the lesson would be. "Sit down," he said when I entered the main room. I sat. "Dorothy told me what you did. I'm going to ask you one question, and I want an honest answer. Did you open any sealed door?" "No. I used the intercom only." He nodded slowly. "Then our physical security is intact. That's something." He sipped his coffee. "You told them your name?" "Yes." "You told them this was your grandparents' property?" "Yes." "So if they survive the day and encounter anyone else, they can describe our location with enough detail for anyone to find us." I hadn't thought about that. The realization sat in my stomach like a stone. "I'm sorry," I said. "Sorry is a feeling. I need a plan." He set down his mug and pulled his binder from the shelf. "You've introduced 2 variables. We manage them or they manage us. Those are the options." Dottie brought her own coffee and sat at the table. "Earl, the girl is hurt. She needs medical attention. She needs to not be infected. Everything else is secondary." "Agreed. So we verify." Earl studied his wife. Whatever anger he'd felt had already metabolized into something more useful, strategic thinking. I could see him working through scenarios, weighing them with the same precision he'd applied to 40 years of preparation. "The quarantine protocol," he said finally, "from the binder." Dottie nodded, like she'd expected this. Earl flipped to a tabbed section and read aloud. "Any individual seeking entry must undergo a 72-hour observation period. During this time, they remain in a designated isolation space with minimal contact. Visual monitoring continuous. Any sign of neurological deterioration, loss of speech coherence, motor irregularity, aggression, results in immediate termination of the observation period and denial of entry. Termination, I said. What does that mean exactly? Earl looked at me. It means they don't get in. And what happens to them? That's their problem, not ours. He closed the binder. The barn can serve as the isolation space. It has the camera. We can communicate via intercom. We can provide limited supplies through the external drop box. Dottie, is it still stocked? Basic medical kit, water, and MREs. Enough for 2 people for 3 days. Then we tell them the terms. 72 hours in the barn. We monitor. If they show no symptoms after 3 days, we discuss next steps. It was harsh, but logical. A middle ground I hadn't been clever enough to construct myself. I felt relief and shame in equal measure. Relief that Earl was willing to engage. Shame that he'd found the rational path, while I'd been operating on pure emotion. I'll make contact, Earl said. Not you. From now on, communications go through me. You've done enough freelancing. Understood. He walked to the intercom panel and pressed the barn switch. Attention. This is the property owner. You're being monitored and your presence is noted. We're willing to provide assistance under specific conditions. On the monitor, Renee and Caleb both snapped to attention, looking around for the speaker's source. Conditions? Caleb said. We'll do whatever you need. You'll remain in that structure for 72 hours. You will not attempt to locate the source of this communication. You will not leave the barn for any reason. In exchange, we'll provide medical supplies, food, and water through an external compartment you'll find on the north wall. A metal panel at knee height. Open it in 5 minutes. 72 hours, Renee repeated. That's 3 days. That's the requirement. And after 3 days? Earl paused. After 3 days, if all goes well, we talk again. He released the switch and turned back to us. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw something besides certainty in his face. It was small, a flicker. But it was there. He was hoping they'd pass. The first 24 hours of observation were uneventful, in the way that watching a pot refuses to boil. Renee and Caleb stayed in the barn, found the supply panel, took the medical kit and food with grateful efficiency. Renee cleaned and bandaged her leg wound properly. She told Caleb she'd been a veterinary technician before everything. And her hands moved with the precision that confirmed it. The cut was on her shin. Long but not deep, consistent with a fence injury. No puncture marks. No crescent shape of a bite. Earl watched this with focused attention and made notes. Wound presentation is consistent with laceration, not bite trauma, he wrote. Subject demonstrates coherent speech, organized behavior, appropriate emotional response. You're writing a clinical report on a human being, I said. I'm protecting my family. You'd prefer I do it carelessly? I didn't push further. Caleb was 29, I'd learn later. Former electrician's apprentice from Walton, where he'd lived his whole life in a house his parents left him. He'd met Renee 2 days into the outbreak. She'd been at the animal clinic when everything collapsed. And he'd found her fighting off an infected person with a catchpole outside the building. They'd been moving north since, following drainage ditches and back roads, avoiding the main corridors where the infected congregated in clusters around stalled vehicles and silent buildings. They talked to each other in the barn the way people talk who've been through shared trauma. Shorthand references to things they'd seen that they didn't need to explain to each other. I listened through the intercom, not broadcasting, just monitoring, as Earl had instructed. I learned about Walton's collapse in fragments, the infection moving through the Dollar General where 30 people had been shopping, the elementary school that someone had tried to use as a shelter before realizing 3 children inside were already turning. The sound, Caleb kept coming back to the sound, of an entire town screaming at once, then going silent. The silence is worse, he told Renee on the first night. When you hear screaming, people are still fighting. When it's quiet, the fight's over. She held his hand while he said this. Not romantically. I could see in their body language that they weren't a couple. Just 2 people who'd chosen each other's survival over solitude, bonded by necessity into something that didn't have a name yet. By the 40-hour mark, Earl's notes had shifted in tone. The clinical detachment was softening, replaced by observations that bordered on approval. Male subject demonstrates practical skills. Repaired barn door hinge using materials at hand. Female subject maintains consistent routine. Wound care morning and evening. Organized supply management. They're good people, I said. They're competent people, Earl corrected. Good is harder to determine. Is there a difference that matters right now? He looked at me over his notebook. Yes. Good people make sacrifices for others. Competent people survive. In an ideal world, we want both. But if I have to choose which type to let into my bunker, I choose competent. They seem like both to me. 40 hours isn't enough to know. Dottie had started cooking for 5, I noticed. Not openly. She hadn't announced it. But the portions she prepared had grown, and she'd begun inventorying the food stores with a different calculation in her eyes. 9 months for 5 people. 7 months if we supplemented with anything recoverable from above. She was already adapting to a future Earl hadn't officially approved. I loved her for it. For the quiet, practical rebellion of a woman who'd married a man, built for contingency, and had spent 50 years being his counterweight. The pull towards mercy, when he defaulted to logic, they worked because they were opposite responses to the same fear. He prepared, she connected. He sealed doors, she found ways to open them without compromising the lock. 32 hours remaining on the observation clock. On the monitor, Renee slept while Caleb kept watch by the barn door, rifle across his knees, keeping watch for them, keeping watch for us. I was starting to hope too. The 72 hours ended at 6 in the morning on what our calendar told us was Saturday. Earl sat at the monitor through the final hour, watching Renee and Caleb sleep in shifts, a pattern they'd maintained for all 3 days without being told to. They were disciplined, organized. They rationed the supplies we'd provided instead of consuming everything immediately. They kept the barn clean, stacking waste in a corner covered with a tarp. They pass, Earl said at 6:15. He said it to Dottie, not to me, and his voice carried a note of something I'd rarely heard from him. Concession. The protocol is satisfied. 72 hours, no symptoms, coherent behavior maintained, wound healing normally without sign of infection. He closed his notebook. They pass. So we bring them down? Earl turned his chair to face both of us. We bring them to the secondary entrance. We introduce ourselves. We explain the situation, what we have, what the rules are, what happens if the rules are broken. They see the bunker, they understand the hierarchy, they agree to terms. Any hesitation, any pushback, any sign that they consider this a democracy, they go back to the barn with a week's supplies and our best wishes. That's fair, I said. It's not about fair. It's about sustainable. He pressed the intercom. Good morning. Your observation period is complete. We're going to make direct contact. Stay where you are. We'll come to you. We ascended for the first time in nearly a week. The house above was unchanged but alien. Breakfast dishes still on the table where we'd left them, eggs congealed to the plate. The air smelled stale, wrong. Through the kitchen window, I could see the yard was empty of infected. They drifted east during the night, following some sound we hadn't detected. Earl moved through the house with his rifle, clearing each room from habit even though the cameras had shown no breach. Then he unlocked the back door, and we walked to the barn in the gray morning light. I hadn't been outside in 6 days. The world was quieter than I'd ever experienced it. No traffic, no planes, no distant machinery, just birds. The birds were still singing, indifferent to catastrophe. Earl pulled open the barn door. Caleb stood immediately, weapon raised, then lowered it when he saw us. An old man with a rifle, an old woman with a medical bag, and me, empty-handed and trying to look non-threatening. "I'm Earl," my grandfather said. "This is Dorothy. That's Marcus. He's the one who spoke to you first." Renee was standing now, favoring her injured leg but steady. She looked at me with eyes that held 3 days of uncertainty crystallized into this single moment of resolution. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to help us?" "No," Earl agreed. "We didn't. Here are the terms." He laid them out with military economy. The bunker existed. It was his. His rules governed its use absolutely. They would contribute labor as assigned: maintenance, monitoring, supply management. They would not access the communication station without permission. They would not modify any system. They would not leave without informing the group. And if at any point their presence compromised the safety of the original 3 occupants, they would be asked to leave. Immediately and without discussion, Earl said. "Those are the terms." Caleb looked at Renee. She nodded. "We agree," Caleb said. "Completely." Earl studied them for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Caleb shook it. Renee shook it. Dottie embraced them both, which made Renee cry. A sudden, sharp release of tension that she quickly controlled. "Come inside," Dottie said. "I'll make breakfast." We walked back to the house as a group of 5. Earl led. Caleb and Renee moved with the cautious awareness of people who'd spent days exposed, scanning the tree line, checking over their shoulders. When we reached the kitchen door, Renee paused. "This is real?" she asked. "You actually have a plan?" "We have more than a plan," Earl said. "We have time. Now get inside before we waste it." The first week, as a group of 5, established a rhythm that Earl orchestrated with characteristic precision. Caleb was assigned to generator maintenance. His electrical background made him immediately valuable. And Earl recognized competence with the instinct of a man who'd managed teams in crisis for decades. Renee took over medical inventory, cataloging every bandage and antibiotic with the organized efficiency of someone accustomed to veterinary supply chains. I was communications, monitoring radio frequencies, logging broadcasts, building a picture of what was happening beyond our property line. What was happening was collapse. Total, accelerating, irreversible collapse. The military had established a perimeter around Cincinnati on day 3 that held until day 5, then fractured at 6 points simultaneously when infected overwhelmed a refugee processing checkpoint. Louisville went dark on day 4. Columbus, where my mother lived, stopped broadcasting on day 6. I listened to that silence with a grief I couldn't process and a hope I couldn't justify. Maybe she'd made it out. Maybe the silence meant the station fell, not the city. Maybe. Earl didn't offer false comfort. "Your mother's smart," he said. "She always was. If anyone could find a way." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The gap in his sentence held everything: love for his daughter, knowledge of the odds, refusal to lie. Dottie was quieter about it. She prayed in the mornings, something I'd known she did but never witnessed so directly. Kneeling beside her cot in the small room she shared with Earl, hands folded, lips moving silently. She never asked me to join. She never said God would protect my mother. She just prayed. And I understood it as her version of Earl's preparation, doing the only thing available to her about the things she couldn't control. Renee and Caleb integrated faster than I expected. Part of this was Dottie's influence. She treated them like family from the first meal, asking questions about their lives before, remembering details, creating the social fabric that makes confinement bearable. Part of it was Earl's clarity. When roles are defined and expectations explicit, people relax into structure. There's no ambiguity to navigate, no politicking, no unspoken hierarchy to decode. But part of it, the part that surprised me most, was Caleb himself. He was naturally deferential without being weak, respectful of Earl's authority without surrendering his own judgment. On the third day, he noticed a vibration in the generator housing and flagged it before it became a failure. Earl inspected it, confirmed the issue, and said, "Good catch." 2 words, but they landed like an anointment. Renee was harder to read. She participated fully, met every expectation, contributed beyond her assigned role. But at night, on the barn camera we still monitored out of habit, I'd sometimes see her sitting alone in the main bunker room after everyone else slept, staring at nothing, her face blank with something beyond exhaustion. I asked her about it on day 9. "I had a dog," she said. "At the clinic, a border collie named Patch who'd been surrendered because his owners couldn't afford his hip surgery. I was fostering him. When everything started, I had to leave and he was in a kennel in the back room. I couldn't. The infected were already inside the lobby. I couldn't get to him. I'm sorry. He's probably dead. He's definitely dead. But sometimes I think about him waiting, wondering why no one came." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, quick, almost angry. "It's stupid. People are dead. My neighbors are dead. And I'm awake at 3 a.m. thinking about a dog." "It's not stupid. It's something," she said. "Something I carry. We all carry something, right? What's yours?" I thought about my mother, about the silence from Columbus, about the particular shame of being safe while people you love might not be. "I don't know yet," I said. "I think I'm still accumulating." She nodded like that made sense. Like accumulation was a phase she recognized from her own progression through grief. We sat in silence together until the ventilation system's hum carried us both toward something resembling peace. On day 14, the radio brought us something new. Not emergency broadcasts. Those had deteriorated into loops, automated systems repeating shelter-in-place orders to an audience that either couldn't hear them or no longer needed advice they'd already followed or failed to follow. What came on day 14 was a human voice, calm and deliberate, broadcasting on a frequency Earl recognized. "That's military," he said, leaning forward. "Not public military. Operational frequency. Someone with real equipment." The voice identified itself as Staff Sergeant Dana Whitfield, broadcasting from a fortified position at the Boone County Fairgrounds, 12 miles northwest. She reported a survivor enclave of approximately 40 people, organized and defended. She reported that the perimeter was holding. She reported that they were seeking contact with other organized groups. "They're recruiting," Earl said. "Or networking," I suggested. Same thing with different framing. He listened to the broadcast 3 more times as it repeated on a loop. Then he sat back and did something I hadn't seen from him before. He looked uncertain. 40 people, Dottie said. That's substantial. Substantial means resource demands. 40 people burn through supplies fast, especially if they're agricultural and competent, which most people are. They'll be looking to expand their supply chain. We're within their expansion radius. You think they'd take our supplies by force? Caleb asked. I think 40 desperate people with military leadership are capable of redefining the concept of voluntary contribution. Earl drummed his fingers on the table. But I also think 12 miles of infected territory is a meaningful buffer. They won't expand physically for a while. Should we respond? I asked. Not yet. We monitor. We learn their patterns. We assess whether they're stable or fragmenting. If they survive a month, they're worth talking to. If they collapse in 2 weeks, they're a cautionary tale. We monitored. For 6 days, Whitfield's broadcast continued. Twice daily, same frequency, increasingly detailed. She reported supply levels, low but manageable, medical capabilities, 1 EMT, 1 retired nurse, and defensive incidents, 3 perimeter breaches, all contained with minimal casualties. She reported that the infected were thinning in their area. Earl's biological unsustainability theory potentially confirmed, at least locally. On day 20, her broadcast changed. The calm was still there, but strained at its edges. We've received information from a contact in the National Guard remnant that a second-wave phenomenon is being observed in urban centers. Infected individuals that were previously slowing down are reanimating with increased aggression after consuming, after feeding. This contradicts earlier projections of natural die-off. Repeat, the die-off is not occurring in areas where infected have access to food sources. Earl's hand tightened on his pen. He didn't speak for a long time. The 79 subjects, he finally said. We burned them before we could observe long-term behavior. We assumed metabolic burnout. But if they can sustain, if consumption restores function, then they don't die off, I finished. Then they adapt. Then this isn't a weeks-long event, it's... He stopped, looked at his binder, looked at the supply calculations he'd based on an assumption that had just collapsed. Dottie put her hand over his. We recalculate, she said. 18 months of food for 5 people assumed a finite external threat window, Earl said. If the threat is indefinite, 18 months is not a plan. It's a delay. Then we make a longer plan, Caleb said. He said it simply, without drama, like someone stating the obvious. We grow food. We fortify. We make this sustainable for years, not months. Earl looked at him. In that look was the moment my grandfather accepted something fundamental about their situation. He couldn't solve it alone. His decades of preparation had been necessary, but insufficient. The bunker was a bridge, not a destination. All right, Earl said. We recalculate. Everything. He opened a fresh page in his notebook. At the top he wrote, Phase 2, Indefinite Sustainability. Under it, for the first time, he wrote 5 names instead of 3. The garden plan was Earl's, but the execution was Caleb's genius. The property had 2 acres of workable land behind the barn, former tobacco field, fallow for 20 years, but still rich soil. The problem was exposure. Working above ground meant visibility, noise, and vulnerability. Infected still moved through our area in irregular patterns, fewer than the first week, but present, unpredictable, drawn by any sound louder than natural ambience. Caleb proposed a schedule. work in pre-dawn hours when the infected were least mobile. We'd observed through infrared cameras that their activity dropped significantly in cold temperatures. Set up raised beds first, since they'd require fewer days of exposed labor. Prioritize calorie-dense crops, potatoes, beans, squash. Harvest rainwater using the barn's existing gutter system, modified to feed into concealed cisterns. I can wire a silent alarm system around the perimeter, he added. Motion sensors on a closed circuit. No sound, just a light panel in the bunker that tells us which sector has movement. Earl stared at him. You can do that with what we have. Give me the wiring from the barn's old electrical and some of the sensor components from the security cameras, the spares in storage. I can do it in 3 days. It took him 2. By day 24, we had a silent perimeter system that divided our property into 8 sectors, each with a corresponding LED on a panel Caleb mounted beside the monitor station. Green meant clear. Red meant movement. It wasn't perfect. Animals triggered it occasionally, but it gave us awareness without requiring constant camera monitoring. Earl's respect for Caleb grew visibly. Not warmth, exactly. Earl wasn't built for warmth with anyone except Dottie, but recognition. He began consulting Caleb before making decisions about the property's physical infrastructure. The dynamic shifted from employer labor to something approaching partnership. Though Earl would never have used that word, Renee contributed differently but equally. Her veterinary background included enough overlap with human medicine to make her our functional medic. She reorganized the medical supply inventory, identified expiration risk items that needed to be used sooner, and created treatment protocols for common injuries we might sustain during surface work. She also identified edible plants in our surrounding woodland that could supplement crops, an unexpected skill she'd developed growing up rural in southern Kentucky. My grandmother was Appalachian, she explained one evening while showing us a field guide she'd found in the bunker's reference library. Knew every plant in the holler. What healed, what fed, what killed. I thought it was backward when I was young. Couldn't wait to get away from it. Now? She shrugged. Now I'd give anything for one more afternoon walking with her. Dottie nodded. The things we dismiss from our elders always turn out to be the things we need most. I saw Renee look at Earl when Dottie said this. Look at him with an understanding that maybe hadn't been there before. Earl was the elder here. His preparation, his protocols, his rigidity. All of it was the same impulse Renee's grandmother had expressed through plant knowledge. Survival wisdom dismissed as paranoia until the moment it saves your life. Day 28. A full month underground. The last week increasingly split between bunker time and careful surface excursions. The first potato beds were prepared. The rainwater system was operational. The perimeter alarm hadn't shown sustained infected presence in 4 days. They were drifting, drawn toward population centers where food sources remained. I was monitoring the radio when Whitfield's broadcast came through with a new addition. Any organized groups in the Kenton County area, we are proposing a regional coordination meeting. Date, 10 days from this broadcast. Location to be communicated on a secure frequency for those who respond. We believe cooperation increases everyone's survival probability. Respond on this frequency if interested. I looked at Earl. He'd heard it. 10 days, he said. What do you think? He was quiet for a long time. Then, I think 40 people 12 miles away have noticed we exist. The question is whether we go to them or wait for them to come to us. We debated for 3 days. Not argued. Earl didn't argue. He presented positions and countered alternatives with the structured patience of a man who'd run briefings for decades. But this was a genuine discussion. The first time all 5 voices carried roughly equal weight. Caleb favored making contact. 12 miles is close enough that they'll find us eventually. Better to establish the relationship on our terms. Show up organized, capable, bringing something to the table. If we wait until they discover us, we're reactive. Renee was cautious. What do we actually know about these people? A military voice on a radio. 40 people we've never seen. For all we know, they've taken resources from others by force and are looking for more. That's possible, Earl conceded. But Whitfield's broadcasts have been consistent, detailed, and strategically transparent. If she were running a predatory operation, she'd be less forthcoming about vulnerabilities. Low supplies, limited medical capability? She's advertising weaknesses because she's genuinely seeking cooperation. Predators don't admit weakness. Dottie said nothing for a long time. Then, I think we send 2 people, not all 5. 2 go, 3 stay. If something goes wrong, the home base is protected. This was the consensus that formed. 2 representatives, traveling light, armed, but not threatening. Earl would stay. He was the irreplaceable knowledge holder, the architect of everything we'd built. Dottie would stay because Earl would not function without her, and because the bunker needed a decision maker if something went wrong. That left Caleb, Renee, and me. 1 would stay as security for the property. 2 would go. I'm going, I said. It's my grandparents' property. I represent the family. I'll go with him, Caleb said. 2 men, moving fast, less likely to be targeted than a mixed pair if we encounter unknowns. That logic is flawed, Renee said flatly. 2 men reads as a threat to anyone watching. 1 man and 1 woman reads as refugees. Less intimidating. I should go. She was right, and we all knew it. Caleb conceded with grace. Then I stay and maintain the property. The alarm system needs daily checks anyway. Earl spent the next 2 days preparing us. Routes mapped from terrain knowledge he'd accumulated over 40 years of living here. Landmarks, safe points, drainage ditches that provided concealed travel corridors. Timing. We'd depart at 3 a.m., moving through the coldest, darkest hours, when infected activity dropped to its minimum. We should reach the fairgrounds by dawn if we maintained pace. If you encounter infected, avoid, do not engage. You move around them, not through them. Your weapons are last resort, not first option. Every shot is a sound event that cascades. Understood? Understood. If you reach the fairgrounds and the situation looks wrong, if it feels wrong, if your gut says wrong, you turn around immediately. You owe these people nothing. You owe this family everything. Understood. If you don't return within 36 hours, I seal the bunker and write you off. I won't come looking. I can't. 3 people survive here. 5 do not if 2 are lost trying to save the original 2. It's mathematics. I know. He looked at me the way he had when I was 12 and learning to handle his hunting rifle. Trust and fear in equal measure. Be smart, he said. Not brave, smart. I will. The night before departure, Dottie pulled me aside. She pressed something into my hand, a small compass, brass, antique. I recognized it. It had sat on Earl's desk in the study my entire life. It was his father's, she said. He'd be upset I gave it to you for this. But you need something to bring back, and that way, you'll make sure you do. I closed my fingers around it. The brass was warm from her palm. I'll bring it back, I said. You'll bring yourself back, she corrected. The compass is just the excuse. I packed my bag. 3 days of food, water purification tablets, a handgun Earl had taught me to shoot when I was 16, and the compass, buttoned into my breast pocket like a heartbeat I could feel through my shirt. We left at 3 a.m. into a darkness so complete I had to let my eyes adjust for 5 full minutes before moving. No moon. Overcast sky. The world was black except for the faint green glow of Caleb's perimeter LEDs behind us, marking the border of the only safety we knew. Renee moved beside me with practiced quiet. 3 weeks of surface excursions had taught us both to walk without snapping branches, to breathe through our noses, to communicate with gestures rather than whispers. We followed the drainage ditch south for a quarter mile, then turned northwest through a tree line that would eventually connect to a series of farm roads. The first infected we encountered was at the 2-mile mark. A single figure standing motionless in a field to our east. Not moving, not hunting, just standing, facing south, like it had been walking and simply stopped. Batteries running down in real time. Earl's biological deterioration theory, visible. Still, I mouthed to Renee. We were already still. We watched it for a count of 60. It didn't turn. We moved on. The landscape between our property and the fairgrounds was rural. Farms, woodlots, 2-lane roads that wound between gentle hills. Before the outbreak, it had been unremarkable Kentucky countryside. Now it was a graveyard painted in negative space. Not bodies everywhere, but the absence of life. No livestock, no lights, no sound but our footsteps and the occasional distant sound of something we couldn't identify and didn't want to. At mile 4, we found a farmhouse with its front door hanging open. No movement inside on visual inspection. Renee touched my arm and pointed. In the doorway, a smear on the frame. Dark, old. The story of what had happened inside, written in a single brushstroke. We kept moving. Mile 6 was harder. A road crossing we couldn't avoid required us to traverse 50 yards of open pavement. I scanned in both directions, nothing visible. We moved fast, crossing in under 30 seconds, then into the cover of a hedgerow on the far side. My heart was hammering, not from exertion, from the exposure, the feeling of being seen by something you can't see. Every shadow had weight out here. Every rustle in vegetation had intent. "You okay?" Renee whispered. "Yeah, you?" My legs holding. Let's keep moving. By 5 a.m., the sky was beginning to lighten. A gray suggestion of dawn at the eastern edge. We were at mile 9, following a creek bed that would take us within a mile of the fairgrounds. And here we hit our first real problem. The creek bed was occupied. Not by 1 or 2 infected, by a cluster. 12, maybe 15, arranged along the water's edge like they'd been drawn there and gotten stuck. Some were kneeling. Some were lying in the shallow water. One was drinking, or trying to, making lapping motions with a face that was no longer configured for the task. "Back," Renee breathed. We retreated 50 yards and reassessed. "We go around," I said, "up the east bank through that orchard. It adds a quarter mile but keeps us above their sight line." "Sound carries over water," Renee said. "We need to be careful about our footfalls on the slope, loose gravel." We took the long route. It took 20 minutes of painstaking movement, testing every step before committing weight, moving like people defusing bombs with their feet. The infected at the creek never turned, never acknowledged our existence. We were ghosts passing through their world, invisible through silence and patience. At 5:45, through the trees ahead, I saw it. The chain-link perimeter of the Boone County Fairgrounds, reinforced with stacked vehicles and what looked like corrugated metal sheeting. Guard positions at intervals, manned. Alive. Renee touched my arm. "Let them see us coming," she said. "Hands visible. Walk normal. We're not a threat." I raised my hands. We stepped out of the tree line into the open ground before the perimeter, walking slowly, deliberately, like two people arriving at a place they'd been invited to. A light hit us. A voice called out, "Halt! Identify yourselves." "We're from a property south," I called back. "We heard your broadcast. We're here to talk." A pause. Then, advance slowly, one at a time, weapons on the ground. We'd arrived. Staff Sergeant Dana Whitfield was not what I expected. I'd built her in my mind from her radio voice. Imagined someone large, imposing, commanding physical space, the way her broadcasts commanded the airwaves. In person, she was 5'4", wiry with close-cropped hair and eyes that evaluated everything they touched with immediate, unflinching assessment. She met us in what had been the Fairgrounds Administration Building, now converted into a command center with maps pinned to every wall, a bank of radios, and a whiteboard covered in supply calculations and perimeter schedules. "You responded to the broadcast," she said. Not a question. "We monitored for a while first," I said. "Wanted to be sure." Smart. Most people who show up here are reactive, fleeing something, not approaching something. The fact that you prepared, observed, and chose to come puts you in a different category. She gestured for us to sit. "Tell me about your group." I told her the broad strokes. 5 people, secure location with supplies, agricultural capacity being developed, technical skills present. I didn't mention the bunker specifically, didn't describe the exact location, didn't name Earl or reveal his background. She noticed what I withheld without remarking on it. "You're cautious," she said. "Good. I am too. Here's what I'll give you. We have 43 people here, down from 47. 2 lost to infected breach, 2 departed voluntarily. We have security, medical care that's basic but functional, and enough food for about 6 weeks. After 6 weeks, we're in trouble unless we develop agricultural capacity or trade relationships." "Trade," Renee said. "With whom?" "You, potentially. We've identified 3 other organized groups in a 30-mile radius. One north, industrial compound. They have manufacturing capability but no food production. One east, hospital complex, medical supplies but low on personnel. And now you, south, agricultural potential, small group, secure." "You want a network," I said. "I want survival at scale. Individual groups are vulnerable to single-point failures. A network distributes risk." She leaned forward. "I'm not proposing merging. I'm proposing mutual aid with boundaries. Each group maintains sovereignty. Each group contributes what it can. Nobody owes more than they can sustain." It was reasonable. More than reasonable. It was sophisticated. The kind of thinking that survives crises because it acknowledges human nature rather than fighting it. "I need to take this back to my group," I said. "We don't make decisions unilaterally. Expected and respected." She stood. "I'll give you a radio frequency for secure communication, encrypted, low power, short range. Your technical person can set it up?" "He can." "Then go home, discuss, and contact us within a week." She extended her hand. I shook it. Her grip was firm without being performative. "One more thing. The second wave behavior I mentioned in the broadcast, it's real and it's local. We lost those 2 people last week to infected that were faster, more reactive than anything we saw in week 1. They're evolving or adapting, or whatever word you want to use. The clock is ticking on isolated survival. Together is the only math that works long-term. Renee and I departed at midday, moving back along our route while the sun was high and visibility maximal. The return trip was faster. We knew the path, knew the obstacles, and daylight gave us sighting distance that darkness hadn't. The creek cluster was gone, moved on to somewhere else. The motionless figure in the field was still there, hadn't shifted an inch. Truly stalled, its biology consuming the last of whatever fuel it had. We reached our property by late afternoon. Caleb met us at the perimeter, alerted by his sensor system. He looked relieved in a way that made me realize he'd spent 12 hours imagining the worst. "How was it?" he asked. "Promising," Renee said. "Complicated. We need to talk to everyone." Earl was waiting at the bunker entrance. He saw the compass still buttoned in my pocket, and something in his shoulders released. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me everything." I did. Earl listened to our full debrief without interrupting. He sat with his notebook open but didn't write, just absorbed, his face cycling through micro-expressions I'd learned to read over a lifetime of watching him think. When I finished describing Whitfield's network proposal, he was quiet for nearly 2 minutes. Then, "She's right." I blinked. I'd prepared arguments. I'd marshaled talking points about mutual benefit, distributed risk, the impossibility of indefinite isolation. I hadn't prepared for immediate agreement. "Don't look at me like that," Earl said. "I'm rigid, not stupid. The second-wave data changes everything. If infected are sustaining rather than deteriorating, our timeline for self-sufficiency collapses. We need external relationships." "So we participate?" Caleb asked. "We participate carefully. We maintain operational security about this bunker's specifics. We represent ourselves as a capable group with agricultural output. We trade surplus, once we have it, for things we can't produce. Medical supplies primarily, manufactured goods if the northern group has capacity. We don't host. We don't absorb. We remain 5. 5 is our number?" Renee asked. Earl looked at her steadily. 5 is our capacity for this space, and these supplies without rationing to starvation. If the math changes, if we develop surplus agriculture that supports more, we revisit. But I won't promise what we don't have. It was more flexibility than he'd shown a month ago. When 2 strangers in his barn had been an existential threat, something had shifted in him. Not his caution, but the scope of what he was willing to consider. Caleb and Renee had earned that shift through competence and consistency. Whitfield had earned it by being right about something he couldn't deny. We established radio contact 2 days later. Caleb configured the encrypted frequency with equipment from Earl's communications station, and our first transmission was brief. Confirmation of interest, commitment to a follow-up meeting, nothing specific about location or resources. Whitfield acknowledged and proposed a rotating meeting point at a crossroads roughly equidistant between our locations. The first formal meeting happened on day 38. This time, Earl came. He insisted, and none of us argued. He needed to see Whitfield himself, to evaluate her with the eyes that had spent decades assessing threats and allies. They met at the crossroads, a 4-way stop between harvested cornfields, open in all directions, no tactical advantage for either party. Earl brought his rifle but kept it slung. Whitfield came with 1 guard, armed but relaxed. They shook hands and stood in the road talking for an hour while the rest of us maintained perimeter watch. I don't know exactly what they discussed. Earl told us afterward in summary, she'd confirmed her background. National Guard reservist, activated during the initial response, separated from her unit when communications collapsed. Her group's composition, mostly civilian, 12 with military or law enforcement experience. And her long-term vision, regional stability through interconnected autonomous communities. She's smart, Earl said. Idealistic, but not naive. She understands power dynamics. She won't try to absorb us because she knows we'd resist, and it would cost more than it gains. Do you trust her? Dottie asked. Earl considered this longer than anything else. I trust her competence. I trust her strategic logic. Trust on a personal level. That takes longer. But we don't need personal trust for this to work. We need reliable mutual self-interest. That's a bleak way to frame cooperation, I said. It's an honest way. Bleak and honest are often the same thing. But he almost smiled when he said it, and I saw Dottie squeeze his hand under the table. That night, for the first time, Earl updated his binder. He removed the page that read, Phase 2, Indefinite Sustainability, and replaced it with something new. I didn't see what he wrote, but I saw him write 5 names across the top, not as resources, not as variables, but as people, as family. The binder was evolving. So was he. Day 50 brought the first real test of our network. Whitfield's voice came through the radio at 4 a.m., not her scheduled broadcast, but an emergency transmission. Fairgrounds to all network points. We are experiencing a large-scale approach. Estimated 60+ infected from the east. This is not a standard drift pattern. They appear directed, moving in a coherent group, requesting any available support. Repeat, requesting support. Earl was at the radio before I'd fully awakened. Acknowledged Fairgrounds. Defines support requested. Any armed personnel who can reach our eastern perimeter within 4 hours. We have the bodies to hold, but not the depth. If they breach our primary line, we don't have a secondary. Earl looked at us. This was the moment. The exact juncture where network theory becomes network practice. Where mutual aid stops being a concept and starts being risk. I'll go, Caleb said immediately. Not alone, Earl said. Marcus goes with you. 2 shooters from us, in addition to whatever the other network groups contribute. Dottie, Renee, you maintain property security. Seal the bunker if anything approaches. Earl, I started. I know what you're going to say. I'm too old, I'm too valuable, I can't be risked. All true. Go. Caleb and I armed ourselves and moved fast. Faster than my trip with Renee had been. Daylight, familiar terrain, adrenaline. We covered the 12 miles in under 3 hours, arriving at the fairgrounds' eastern perimeter to find Whitfield's people already positioned behind their vehicle barricade, weapons ready, faces tight. And we could see them coming. Across the open ground to the east, a mass. Not 60, more. They moved together in a way I hadn't seen before. Not coordinated exactly, but entrained. Like a flock of birds responding to some shared stimulus, changing direction in unison without apparent communication. Second-wave behavior, Whitfield said, appearing beside us with a rifle. They've been feeding. They're faster, more reactive. And they're grouping now, following the largest sound source to the largest food source. That's us. What's the plan? Caleb asked. Hold the line. Concentrated fire at choke points. We've channeled the approach with trenches and wire. They'll bottle up at the gaps. We need shooters there. She pointed to elevated positions on either side of the main gap. Can you shoot? Yes. Then get up there. What followed was the longest 2 hours of my life. I will not describe the violence in detail, not because it doesn't matter, but because the specifics are less important than the weight of it. The sound, the relentlessness, the way a body with a shattered leg keeps crawling forward because the brain driving it doesn't process pain as a signal to stop. The smell, wrong, chemical, like burnt plastic and copper. We held 43 defenders plus 2 from our group plus 6 from the northern compound who'd arrived 30 minutes after us. The choke points worked. The trenches worked. Whitfield's planning, tested under real pressure, proved sound. By the time it was over, the ground before the perimeter was still in a way that meant it was finished. 11 defenders were injured. 2 were dead, not from bites but from falls and crush injuries in the chaos. Caleb and I stood on the elevated position, rifles empty, hands shaking. I'd never shot anything alive before that day. The weight of what we'd done settled over me like a physical substance. Not guilt exactly, because they weren't people anymore. Not in any sense that allowed for guilt. But heaviness. The heaviness of participating in something final. Whitfield found us afterward. She didn't thank us with words. She gripped Caleb's shoulder, then mine, and nodded once. It was enough. "Your grandfather was right to be cautious about us," she said to me. "But we held today because of the network. That's the proof." I looked at the perimeter, at the people cleaning weapons, treating wounds, holding each other, at the 2 covered bodies being carried inside with ceremony. "Yeah," I said, "that's the proof." We returned home that evening. Earl was at the perimeter waiting. He'd monitored what he could through radio traffic, filling gaps with imagination that was probably worse than reality. When he saw us walking up the drainage ditch, intact, upright, he closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then he was himself again. "Report," he said. We reported everything, including the 2 dead defenders, the scale of the assault, the second-wave behavior confirmed in terrifying detail. Earl listened and then did something unexpected. He sat down on the porch step, right there in the open air, and took a breath that seemed to empty him. "I should have been there," he said. "No," I said. "You should have been exactly where you were, keeping this safe." "I know that strategically. I'm telling you what I feel." He looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my grandfather without his armor. Not the prepared man, not the protocol designer, not the 40-year sentinel, just a 78-year-old man who'd sent his grandson into danger and waited in a bunker, not knowing if he'd see him again. "I feel like I've been building walls my whole life," he said. "And today someone tested them and they held. But it wasn't my walls that held. It was people. People I didn't choose, didn't predict, didn't plan for." Dottie appeared behind him. She put her hands on his shoulders. "That's always how it works," she said. "Plans give you time. People give you survival." He reached up and covered her hand with his. Then he stood, straightened, and was Earl again. Contained, directed, forward-looking. "We need to improve our contribution capacity to the network," he said. "Today we sent 2 shooters. Next time we send supplies too. Caleb, can you expand the garden plan by a factor of 3? If I have help, yeah. You'll have help. Renee, medical training for all 5 of us. Combat first aid minimum. Can you teach it?" "I can teach it." "Good. Marcus?" He looked at me. "Communications are now your permanent role. You're our interface with the network. You maintain relationships, coordinate logistics, represent us in meetings. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Then we're restructuring, not just surviving anymore. Contributing, building something." That night, the 5 of us sat around the table in the bunker. The same table where Earl had eaten breakfast alone, for 40 years before Dottie would join him. We ate together. Not MRS. Dottie had prepared something real from our stores, with herbs Renee had gathered from the woodland edge. It tasted like home in a way that had nothing to do with the food and everything to do with the people eating it. Earl raised his water glass. He'd never been a man for toasts or speeches. But he raised his glass and said, "To the living." We repeated it, "To the living." Outside, the world was still broken. The infected still wandered. Communities still struggled. The future was uncertain at every scale. Would the network hold? Would the crops grow? Would the second wave behavior escalate? Would there ever be enough safety to stop counting days and start counting years? But in that moment, underground, 5 people who'd become a family through circumstance and choice sat together and acknowledged that they were alive, that being alive mattered, that what they built from this point forward would be constructed not from fear, though fear had started it, but from the harder, more enduring material of mutual obligation. Earl's bunker had saved us, but it was never going to be enough on its own. Nothing built for isolation survives contact with reality. What survives is adaptation, connection, the willingness to let the plan change when the world changes. We were 5. We were connected to others. We were building something. That was enough to sleep on. I still carry the compass. It sits in my breast pocket every time I leave the property. For network meetings, for supply runs, for the increasingly routine trips to the fairgrounds where Whitfield's community has become something permanent. I carry it not because I need direction, but because it reminds me of the morning Dottie pressed it into my palm and told me to bring myself back. Earl is still Earl. He plans, he prepares, he maintains systems with daily discipline. But his binder has a section now called External Relations that didn't exist 3 months ago. And his notebook contains names he didn't know in spring. He's evolving at 78, which might be the most remarkable thing I've witnessed in a world full of remarkable and terrible things. We are not safe. That's the truth I've accepted. Safety is not a state. It's a practice. A daily choice made in the company of people you trust, with increasing confidence, but never complete certainty. The world ended. Then it started again, smaller and stranger, shaped by people who refuse to let ending be the final word. I refuse. We refuse. That's the whole story.